Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today is a first. It is a return guest from my client, Catalyst Clinical Research. About 4.5 years ago, I got a message from a guy named Nick Dyer on LinkedIn. Nick was then a new CEO at Catalyst Clinical Research. And we got engaged in a conversation around building the culture at Catalyst that Nick and his team were envisioning. Now, fast forward here to 2023, Catalyst has experienced exponential growth. And Nick and I had a conversation on this podcast about 1.5 years ago to talk about the journey at that point. And I felt it was important to invite them back and to have another conversation because of their massive growth that Catalyst has experienced. And Nick, in his wisdom and insight, said, I want to include one of my team members. And so in this conversation, we're joined by Senior Director of Clinical Monitoring, Jen Miller. And together, we explore where Catalyst has been, where it is now, and where it's going in terms of its culture. They have made an unabashed commitment and investment in their culture, and it sets Catalyst apart in the life sciences for what they have done and the intention that they put on, still to this day, on their culture. As Nick says in the conversation, it's not a trophy that sits up on the shelf. It is something that they are constantly working on and developing. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Jen Miller and Nick Dyer from Catalyst Clinical Research. Jen Miller and Nick Dyer. It is so exciting. I've been waiting all week for this, and I am so excited to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having us. Excited to be here.
It's great to see you, Jeff. Hope you're keeping well.
Yep. Doing great. Too much travel right now, but that's going to end in a couple weeks. So I'm excited for that. So I just did a brief introduction of Catalyst and who the two of you are to me. Would love for us to hear your journey. So as I said in the introduction, you've been on this journey around putting priority around the culture of Catalyst. I know, Nick, really since the beginning when you started there 5 years ago, and certainly since I've been involved in your story 4 years ago. But I would love, starting with you, Jen, to tell the story of your last 2 years. You've been at Catalyst coming up on 2 years. And from day one, you came in and you probably even heard about C3 in the hiring process. You came in as an observer. And now, 2 years later, you're a leader and a champion for the culture. And I would love for you to tell that story of the last 2 years, what that's been like going through that process.
Yeah, it's been an exciting one, honestly, Jeff. And I'll tell you, when I first joined Catalyst, I was a bit of an observer, so to speak. So I came in, joined the company. As you mentioned, Catalyst invests in the culture quite heavily. And as part of that C3 curriculum, really spends the first 4 to 5 months of our time here understanding what the culture of the company is, and how we as employees, as individual contributors, as leaders, really contribute and foster that culture, particularly as we grow. So in the initial first few months here, it was really about learning, really sitting back, observing, understanding what that means to Catalyst. Once I was sort of through that program, it was then my job really to be an ambassador of that culture, right? So as a leader in the company, mine is one of a role model. And so I'm here to foster what I learned and really ensure that Catalyst continues to live out those key culture anchors. And Within the Catalyst culture, we have 5 culture anchors that we sort of live by. We exhibit those culture anchors in different ways every day, right? With our clients, with our internal teams, and so my role really is to kind of pivot and flex in between those culture anchors, and as I said, be a role model. So as time has evolved, really what I am now is really just sort of sitting back and observing how we interact with each other, whether that's how we interact as a leadership team, whether that's how we interact as peers, and really trying to foster those culture anchors at every chance I get. And so it may be that a situation has occurred and it didn't end up as we expected. One of our key culture anchors is learning. That's a really critical one for me. I tend to view failure, although I would really like to see failure rebranded as a learning opportunity. If something didn't happen as expected, the go-to answer for me or go-to response for me is always, what did we learn from that? And really trying to institute that as a way of operating within our team, so that we take out the judgment and the being critical of those around us, and really try to take each individual opportunity as a learning opportunity. And how can we improve on that the next time around, right? We use flexibility a lot all across the board, and that flexibility really applies to how we interact with our clients. So our bread and butter, so to speak, are smaller pharma companies, biotech companies. Each of those companies has a unique need. And our job is to really understand what that unique need is and flex around how we might best deliver for them. So it's encouraging our teams to think a little bit outside of the box about how they might deliver on a particular task or a particular responsibility, a particular deliverable, and really think about what is it that the client is looking for, and how do I best give that to them? That flexibility applies to our staff as well. And I know Nick has talked previously about our flexible PTO policy, for example. So it's really recognizing that each of us as individual contributors has a life around our career, and so really providing that flexibility to our employees as well. So my role as it's evolved in my time here is really one of first understanding how Catalyst uses and employs those culture anchors, and then really becoming a role model and an advocate for those culture anchors, and looking for every opportunity in each day to recognize where we can use those culture anchors.
I have to ask, at what point, because you've been to some very large organizations and all talk about culture in some way. But at what point in the last 2 years did you realize that this is legit? Because a lot of people talk about culture, and this isn't to diminish what other people do, but what Catalyst, and you're pointing to a lot of it, what Catalyst does is legitimate. It's real. At what point did you say maybe you said to someone at home or a friend or a former colleague, you said, this is legit. This isn't just words. What can you remember that moment?
I don't know if I remember a particular moment, but I'll tell you this. I was interviewing someone earlier this week, and typically in almost any interview that I do, people will ask, what makes Catalyst special, or why do you love working at Catalyst? And so I pointed to this example, and it really displays for me at a very base level why Catalyst is special. So Catalyst is still a little, I would say, entrepreneurial in nature, in that when we approach a project or a deliverable, we have a set of processes, SOPs, that we follow. But those SOPs give us a lot of latitude in how we actually deliver the product. And that goes back to our core value of flexibility, right? That's by design. But within that, there can be some ambiguity. There can be some times where one individual or one employee may approach a situation differently. And sometimes those things work out well, and sometimes they don't. The thing that really speaks to me at Catalyst is when it doesn't work out the way we thought it was going to work out. We have a culture of learning, of understanding why didn't that work, and now what are we going to do differently the next time. Every time I have gone to one of my senior leaders and said, you know what, I really thought this was going to work out this way and it didn't, they always ask me, why do you think that was? And what is your plan to do differently? In that space, I feel the ability to, one, recognize that something didn't work out and that that's okay, that it's a learning process sometimes. But I also feel the ability to then say, and I think we should approach it differently, and here's what I think we should do. And their response every single time has been, great, how can I support you in that? So it's this environment of constant learning, but also an environment where it's okay to recognize that maybe we didn't do something right the first time. And that's not a failure, so to speak. That's a learning opportunity. And it makes us better every single time.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you for that. Nick, would love to hear your story. Similar, I mean, it's different, but also, you have 5 years, or coming up in November, 5 years. How would you tell the story of your journey around the culture at Catalyst?
Yeah, I mean, so as you said, I started 5 years ago, and the thesis or the commitment I had from day one was to take a pretty small company and to be able to grow that into the organization we are today, where we've got 650 employees around the world. You add out some of our contractor colleagues into the mix, and we've got about 1,000 people working with the company as of last month. And that's, goes from when I was employee number 14. So there was always a plan to grow the organization. And my experience had been that, fast growth companies can lose their soul to some degree if there isn't an intentional culture. And we recognized that our customers and our employees were looking for a type of organization. And so we wanted to be intentional about what we built, with culture being central to that. And so we really I started out with a couple of key colleagues, trying to figure out what that culture dynamic was. And we leaned into the culture anchors, or the value anchors that Jen mentioned, as items that or values that would drive behaviors that then become habits that then underpin the culture of the organization. And they empower people to be able to say, hey, you're not doing what you said, and pulls the organization back to being honest with itself about being what it promised. So we started out, as we said 5 years ago, with this idea of an intentional culture that was rooted in values. And Jeff, you and your team at Brilliance Within helped us then build a core curriculum, Catalyst Core Culture, or C3, that we said, okay, every leader in the company will ultimately go through that, and we've been good to our word on that. But actually, we want to also make sure that that actually infuses itself into everybody in the organization. So we've actually built C3 for me, for our employees as well, and that launches this year. So this has been about scaling up. This has been about growing. This has been about globalizing the organization, and at the heart of that, still maintaining that we are a people business, we are. Our services are based around people, fused with process and technology, but people deliver our work. And we want to be a great employer. We want to be a great service partner. So as our culture infuses itself and we have highly engaged employees, we hope that what that translates into is better customer service delivery, better problem solving, better innovation, and ultimately then benefiting patients that are coming into the clinical trials that we work on. We're able to get those studies open faster. We're able to get the data in and cleaned more efficiently and effectively. So a better all-round experience for every stakeholder, all coming off the fact that we've got this intentional culture. So that's been kind of the vision, if you will. Been interesting, kind of reflecting on my personal role within that. As I mentioned, me and a handful of colleagues at the outset really brainstorming around what the intentional culture needed to be. And then as the organization's grown and we've added more and more management into the mix, my role of what I would say was kind of the architect of the plane and then the pilot of the plane. And now I'm no longer flying the plane. We've taught these other 150 people what the culture intention is. And now I'm sat in the back of the plane. My life depends on how well we've taught those people, right? So I've still got a vested interest because here I am on the plane, but the reality is as I'm no longer flying it. And you get used to that role. And ultimately, my job then is to make sure the next set of pilots get trained properly because I'll still be on the plane with them.
I remember you saying to me once that this type of investment is really an experiment. I mean, it's you talk when you talk, there's authority, but there's also this realization that this is a big experiment, and with any experiment, there's always surprises. And I'm wondering if you look at your journey this being an experiment of sorts, where have you been surprised? Whether pleasantly or shockingly, whatever version of surprise it might be. But if you think about the experiment, where have you been surprised?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that when we talk about being value driven and focused around people, what we're really saying is the moral compass of the company is focused around being kind, having trust, recognizing, as Jen said, that people have a life outside of work and that, work isn't the be all and end all. And so how do you make agreements around that? How do you kind of come to explicit realization with your team? So the moral compass of the organization is around people and treating people, not like numbers or like widgets, or I don't like the word human resources because I feel like I'm not a resource. I'm a person. So we talk about our people and culture department instead of human resources as an example of that. Where I guess I'm surprised is translating employee engagement into performance sometimes is more challenging than I kind of hypothesized it might be in the great experiment. So we have really strong employee engagement feedback, very strong, and feedback we never take it for granted, but we're proud of the engagement we have. Translating that into, like I talked about, faster performance, more innovation, some of the elements that our customers are looking for leadership for us on, it's much harder to translate that engagement into performance all of the time, and it's a little less directly correlated, I would say. That's been a learning. So we've had to talk about not just being people orientated, but performance orientated. And that brings into view accountability, personal accountability, the company's accountability to our customers, and as I mentioned, to sites and the patients participating in our trials, etc. And you've got to bring that language into play, perhaps a little bit more explicitly than we did in the early days, to ensure we're really talking about high engagement, high performance.
Yeah. And on this show, we always like to come to street level. And that's why I love that you're here, Jen, because you're closer to the street than Nick even. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to a real, again, no names, obviously, but if you could speak to a real conversation or a set of conversations where what Nick just described, this relationship between engagement and culture and performance, what does that look like for you in a real life example of translating that.
Yeah, I think, to go back to some of what Nick says, not surprising necessarily, but to maintain the culture that Nick and team has sort of set out with us requires constant vigilance, right? It isn't about just offering people a C3 leadership program for a few months and then assuming that they're experts in that. Nick mentioned, we've had such success with it at the leadership level. We're bringing it down to the individual contributor level now with C3 and Me, and that's really carrying that through to our individual contributor level as well, and helping them understand the vision and the reasoning behind the culture that we try to live every day. I think there is this, for better or worse, there is this philosophy out there around how accountability and loving your people mingle, right? And so, in my view, to really love my people is to hold them accountable, right? Because if they are to develop and grow and learn, they have to have the ability to perform different kinds of responsibilities, different kinds of tasks, and grow in that. And that comes with some accountability. And so I think we're sort of the rubber meeting the road, so to speak, and sort of a real life example is when we say to our folks, we are a culture driven company. We are here to deliver a service, but also to provide an environment where you can do your best work. Sometimes that translates into you're here to make sure I'm happy, right? But what we really need to be doing is making sure that people, yes, happy, but are given an environment to do their best work, right? And so that comes into play when I'm giving someone a task, right? And I say to them, okay, here's the task that I need you to do. It's my responsibility. It's my duty to them to make sure that they have the right amount of knowledge, the right amount of training, the right tools to be able to deliver on that. But it's also my responsibility to make sure that they feel safe coming back to me and saying, I don't understand how to do this piece, or I don't feel like I have the tools to get this part done, and making sure that that's a safe environment for us to explore in, right? So I think that in a real world scenario, and what I've seen here is really making sure that people balance that. We're here to make sure that you're doing a good job and you're happy and that you have everything that you need to deliver, but also that you are accountable to the things that you have to deliver on in order to do, as Nick said, deliver with quality, on time, more effectively, right? So it's that balance of making sure that people understand. We foster an environment where folks can be free to be flexible in how they deliver, to be innovative in how they deliver, to learn as they're delivering, but also that they have to then deliver in the end and deliver with quality and on time.
Yeah. And I love that you're putting really concrete terms around things that are often get a bad rap. Like there's somebody might hear that one of Catalyst's C3 core principles is love your people, or we love our people. And people might bristle at that and see that as soft. But I love where you're pointing us is that it is very, there's not a dotted line, there's a solid line between that principle and results and engagement, going back to the word that Nick mentioned. And I guess, Nick, let's talk about that for a second. The perception of some of these ideas and principles of C3. When you're at a conference and another CEO, you're telling another CEO about some of these core anchors and principles of the culture that's driving Catalyst. And maybe they do bristle. I love your people. Well, we could never say that. We could never use the word love in our environment. What's your response to a peer CEO out there in the world who has that reaction?
Well, I haven't had people bristle necessarily at that, because I think, people have recognized, certainly, the COVID environment, and then some of the challenges we've then seen with, kind of workforce shortages, and the need to really engage people, that people do want to feel appreciated, and they want to feel that they're in an organization that's going to nurture them. So, love being the surrogate for nurturing, for respecting, for appreciating, and so on and so forth. So we just boil that down into that one word. So I think, most executives in most industries have recognized the need to really engage with people, maybe a little differently, to really, attract and then retain the kind of talent that we all need to be able to thrive. So I think it's generally accepted, and so that concept is maybe being embraced a little bit more than perhaps it was 5 years ago. But I think the other thing that I'm able to articulate to other executives, and we had this conversation in June with one particular client, was how this then has translated, and I'm knock on wood as I say this, into a lower degree of staff turnover for our company than our industry typically sees. And that's one point of complaint for most customers and actually sites and other stakeholders in our industry, is that there's a bit of a revolving door of key staff from the work, the projects, and the studies that we're managing. And that creates churn. It can create some quality concerns, certainly create some rework for those other stakeholders as they look to engage with the CRO's project teams. So when we minimize that churn, there's a benefit for everybody. And again, knocking on wood as I say this, we recognize that the commitment to really try to nurture our team with learning, to show we care for our teams, to listen and hear feedback and try to action that feedback. All of that translates into people, we hope, feeling that they're at a company that really treats them as a person, as I said, rather than just a number.